The gospel lesson comes to us from Matthew 13, verses 24 through 30, and then verses 36 through 43. Jesus put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the seeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the household came and said to him, "Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from?" And he answered, "An enemy has done this." The slaves said to him, "Then do you want us to go and gather them?" But he replied, "No, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at the harvest, I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." Then he left the crowds and went into the house. And his disciples approached him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." And he answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age. The reapers are the angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. And the Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom, all causes of sin and all the evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen. This is the gospel of the Lord. There was a belief system that arose in the 2nd century called Gnosticism. And to oversimplify, it posited that all that was spiritual was pure and good, and all that was material was tainted with evil. And the point of this belief system was to find the path that could free the eternal spirit from the material world. Adherents pursued secret knowledge that they believed they could use upon death to move to higher and purer planes of existence. Some Gnostics believed that the world was created by two gods, a good one who made all that was good and spiritual, and an evil one who made the tainted material world. And the two creations were now intermingled. There were some early Christians influenced by Gnosticism, although the church came to see it as a heresy. But one can see the appeal of this parable to those who followed Gnostic ideals. The Son of Man planted the good seed, and then the evil one came and planted the bad seed. There were good disciples, and right beside them it says there are evil disciples. Ones were made by God, the others were made by an evil one. And this parable actually found its way into some Gnostic texts of the time. It's important to remember the primary purpose of parables is to provoke thought. They're not fully developed expositions on theology or anthropology or eschatology. Parables have to be interpreted in light of other scriptures, and we can't take one parable about the kingdom of heaven and the final judgment and decide it tells us everything we need to know about creation and the origin of sin and the nature of the church and the end of all things. And Matthew liked this parable not because of Gnostic elements, because that developed later, but because Matthew viewed Jesus as a great apocalyptic prophet. The world was filled with good and evil, and Jesus, the Son of Man, wrongly crucified by the world, was coming again in power to judge the world. You know, Matthew's perceptions of human as being strictly good or strictly evil is what it can be difficult for us because we live in what one commentator called a post-Freudian world. We see humans as filled with a wide variety of noble and base thoughts and emotions. And if we go looking at other scripture like we need to do when we look at parables, we can see Paul acknowledges that he at times did what was righteous, and he also did things that he said, I was evil also. The weed or the tare that Jesus used in this metaphor was likely something called the bearded darnel. One commentator calls it a plant with no virtues. Here's the description. Its roots surround the roots of good plants, sucking up precious nutrients and scarce water, making it impossible to root out without damaging the good crop. Above ground, darnel can look identical to wheat until it bears seeds. And those seeds can cause anything from hallucinations to death. Bad seed and children of the evil one indeed. Now, here's a side note that relates to my sermon title, an unintended thing that is found hiding there. As observed by the commentators that I quoted, the seeds of the bearded darnel in sufficient quantity are deadly. But in smaller quantities, the milled seeds can be included in bread and beer to produce an intoxicated state in humans. And it was actually grown for that purpose for a while. So I didn't intend it, but wheat or weed has a double entendre looking there. Let's return to the more poisonous meaning of the word. We like to use the word in our day, toxic. We speak of toxic relationships and toxic people. Children from abusive households may rightly see their family members as being toxic. To be toxic is to be poisonous and destructive. And certainly some people and some relationships fall into that category. But I think if we're overly ready to apply that label to others, we get ourselves into trouble. If we consider the truth a little bit, if we review our own history, we're likely to find moments when we were acting like the toxic person, the divider, the strangler of life, that infamous bearded darnel. We can find ourselves in the role for a variety of reasons. We may grow jealous of another's blessings or success, and we want to ruin it for them. We feel hurt over an offense, intended or not, and so we heap insults of our own on others. We seek to hide our own shortcomings by trying to tear down other people. Sometimes we're probably acting toxic just because we had a bad day, and we take it out on somebody else. I certainly hope I'll be judged by God on that final day as wheat and not as a tare. I cling to the promise of God's grace. But if some days I'm capable of being a weed, a tare, perhaps those other ones right around me in the church that I want to label as bearded darnels, as weeds, perhaps they too are wheat who happen to be acting like that for a day instead. The Son of Man directed the angels to leave the tares alone until the final harvest. And here, perhaps, the apocalyptic Jesus is more the gentle shepherd than we realize. Perhaps he lets the evil one think that some of those plants coming up are his, but the Son of Man delays judgment so those bearded darnels have a chance to change and become wheat. If Matthew, the tax collector, who's credited with this gospel, could be a part of the most despised profession of his time, could become a follower, then perhaps we have a chance to change from tare to wheat. If Saul the persecutor could become Paul the church planter, then perhaps we have a chance to grow less toxic and become more of a blessing to others. How should we react in the church when we encounter someone who's acting more like a weed or a tare? I know we often want to do exactly what the angels were suggesting. Jesus, can we just cut that person out? Jesus, can we go to the tool shed for the garden hoe and the pesticide, or the herbicide rather? And I'm not saying we shouldn't draw boundaries when behavior gets out of control, especially when it becomes abusive. We all have to do that in our lives. But God expects us in our healthy moments, our moments when we are more wheat than tare, to react in particular ways to people that are tares right around us. Keep growing, says Jesus. Keep producing. Keep seeking the nutrients you need. Don't run for the hills every time life gets difficult or when people around you, like people in the church, prove difficult. Don't start campaigns to make sure that only nice people go to church, because the place would be pretty empty if that was the case. On those days when we're more than wheat than tare, we can be the ones whose love can encourage someone else to grow a little less like a bearded darnel and more like a disciple of Christ. I received this parable in an email a number of years ago from a member of my church in Ohio. There was an older man in a community who kept very much to himself. The neighborhood he lived in had declined, and there were plenty of rough types now in that neighborhood. And a local church put out a sign up, and they made it publicly available, requesting help for care for the church garden. And wonder of wonders, this man put his name down. He was the only one. He came day after day. One day, 3 gang members from the area happened upon him, and before the pastor, who happened to be looking out the window, could get to him, they had assaulted him and stolen his wallet and his retirement watch. The man didn't respond with anger or insults. He refused to have the police called. He simply told the pastor he hoped they would grow out of it one day. They happened upon him some other times too and tormented him again. And again, he refused to respond with anger or vengeance. One day, the old man took a tumble. And again, before the pastor could get to him, one of those 3 young men, tattooed and even tougher looking now, walked into the garden and leaned over and helped the man up. The pastor stopped and watched. The young man pulled out the man's watch and returned it to him, and he apologized. The old man asked why he was doing that. The young man said, "Everyone else we took our anger out on responded with anger. You responded without anger. You showed me, even though I didn't know it at the time, what love was." Shortly after this incident, the old man died, and at the funeral, the pastor looked out on the congregation and took note of that tattooed and tough character sitting at the back of the church. So once again, the church put out a sign for someone to care for the garden. And the tattooed young man volunteered and cared for the garden for years until he settled down, got married, and started his own family. You know, sometimes the way we talk about one another in the church, we could be as far apart as that old man and those gang members. We judge one another sometimes as having the worst of intentions. We talk around or about others rather than talking to each other. We judge one another to be tares while we think we're the productive wheat. Maybe if we exercise the kind of forbearance and love that this old man showed those gang members, we can be transformed. Maybe we might come to realize the other person was more the wheat than we understood, and we were more the tare than we wanted to admit. Leave the weeds alone. Leave the tares alone, says Jesus. Let them grow. God will sort it out later. Hearing his words gives me hope. It gives hope that my Father's pursuit of those who seem to start as children of the evil is unrelenting. It gives hope that by the time of the judgment, there'll be far fewer weeds than anyone thought. It gives hope that those ranks of weeds or tares may turn out to be rows of wheat, and there's far more wheat than anyone ever imagined. It gives me hope that this weed can become productive wheat. Amen.